Hey guys, many of you have asked similar questions about the study guide for the exam that's on Monday, so I thought I would just go ahead and answer those questions on a little video format so that everybody can have access to my responses. So with that said, many of you guys are asking the question, what is the relationship between a covenant and a canon? So remember in the discussion of covenant, there's typically something called a document clause. Now, a document clause is where the authority, the superior person of the covenant, commands that the covenant be written down and be kept in a safe place. And if anybody touches it, then they're going to be cursed. So here we're having covenant, which, remember, the definition is it's an elected relationship. It's not a natural one. So it's not like my son. My son was just born. He's my son. Our relationship of fatherhood and sonship is natural. It's not elected. However, my wife and I, our relationship, when we came together in marriage, we elected to enter that relationship. So a covenant is an elected relationship under obligation, with obligations put under an oath. So that covenant in the ancient world, remember there was two types of covenants. There was the suzerain vassal covenant, which is typically between international powers, where a superior power demands loyalty from an inferior power. So we talked about the Hittite treaties, but also there was something called a land grant or a royal covenant, where this is built on past loyalty. So a king would exalt one of his nobles or even a peasant to a higher position because of past loyalty. So these are the two types of covenants that we see in Scripture, but the common denominator remains the same. I'm not Scripture, I'm sorry, in the ancient world, including Scripture too. But the common denominator is the same. These are elected relationships that have obligations, and they're put underneath an oath. So those covenants are often put into a document form. So the question is, well, what's now is the relationship between the covenant and the canon? And I'll just read it from my notes, but what I wrote is a canonical document was the customary instrument of covenant administration in the world in which the Bible was produced. I got this quote from a book called Kingdom Through Covenant on page 269 through 270, so if you want to look that up. But so the point is that a canonical document, and what is a canon again? Here's the definition. It's an authoritative revelation um, in documentary form that cannot be altered. So that form now, that document now administers the covenant. So when you want to know, okay, what does this covenant say? You go to the form, you go to the document, and you can read it. So this becomes the means whereby the covenant is administered, ensured, making sure that people are keeping their obligations, and so on. So that was one of the questions that I've received from many of you. The next question I got from a lot of people too is discuss why the entire Old Testament should be considered canonical. So when we're looking at that question, we're really looking at 2 points, at least that I talked about in the lecture. My proposition, this is proposition 2 on lecture 3, and it says the rest of the OT is canonical, since, here's point 1, because the covenant is the plot structure to the entire Old Testament, and since, point 2, the entire Old Testament serves a canonical purpose. So when we're thinking about the covenant being a plot structure, I mentioned this in the notes, so this hopefully will jog your memory. God's covenant with Adam and Eve gives them an identity, namely, they're his image. Second, it also gives them a mission. They're to be fruitful and multiply. Sin comes in and it disturbs that, though. So then we get the next covenant, God's covenant with Noah. What's happening in this covenant is God is promising cosmic stability despite sin. And then when we continue to read, we see that sin is very pervasive. It can't be contained. It's heinous, and it continues. So what happens in the covenant with Abraham in Genesis 12 is despite sin, God is going to accomplish his purposes through Abraham, and God's promised Abraham is a kingdom, land, and descendants. Now that covenant's also given to Isaac, and also given to Jacob. And then we look at the covenant at Mount Sinai. The promise there is that the nation of Israel is going to have prosperity. They're going to flourish. They're going to be in God's place, in God's land. So this is the fulfillment, the partial fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, the promise of a kingdom. And then we see 2 Samuel 7 that says that it's God's covenant with David, that indeed David will have a son who will reign on his throne forever. So the plot structure, Adam and Eve, it's the promise of identity and vocation. Then it's the promise that even in the midst of sin, the cosmos will not be destroyed. And then it continues, the promise of blessings and the promise fulfillment of Genesis 1 of that mission is going to be fulfilled through Abraham. And then that even gets fulfilled with Israel as they're entering into the land to be God's people in his place. And then finally the covenant with David to say, hey, your offspring will always be king. So the covenants here are setting a plot structure that helps pull everything together. So that was a little discussion of one reason why we should consider the whole Old Testament as canonical, because of the plot structure, but we should also consider it as canonical because it all serves a canonical purpose. So here I discussed how the law, namely, gives a little bit of history, but mainly it gives instruction. It talks about the covenant. Now the prophets, the former and the latter prophets, they both give commentary. They basically are saying, Israel, you're not keeping the covenant. You're not doing it, you're not doing it, you're not doing it. Therefore, you will be cursed, just like Deuteronomy 28 promises. And then the wisdom literature also serves a covenantal purpose, which is to discuss what does it look like to be faithful to God in various situations, really from the perspective of the human. So what does it look like to be wise even when you suffer? And you're suffering, and your actions shouldn't have given you suffering. This is a righteous sufferer, like in Job. Or what does it look like to be in love with a woman, to be in love with a human? This is Song of Solomon. What does it look like to be wise in all types of interactions? That's Proverbs. What does it look like to sing to the glory of the Lord as God's people? This is the book of Psalms. So again, let's recap. How does the whole Bible serve a covenantal purpose? Well, you have the exposition of the covenant in Genesis, and then you have commentary on the covenant, and then you have a further working out of covenant faithfulness in all areas of life. So that would be how you'd want to answer why the whole Old Testament should be considered canonical. And then argue, some people have also asked about 5G, argue that the Old Testament canon was closed during the Second Temple period. Okay, so let me pull down my notes real quick. That was the last point of lecture 3. So my first point was to say that there's a lot of Second Temple documents that clearly indicate that there's no prophet. So we see that in 1 Maccabees 4:46 and 14:41. There's no prophet. So there's certain decisions that come up that they're not able to make. If there was an authoritative prophet there, they wouldn't say that. So there's no prophet. In 1QS, this is the community rule in Qumran. This is one of the documents that really guided their community. There's this understanding that there is no authoritative prophet there. We see this in 1Q, column 1, in lines 1 through 3, where you have the teacher of this community. He's not on the same level as Moses and the prophets, but rather he is to teach according to what they commanded. Also, we continue to see that the instructor, the teacher of this community is not authoritative because he doesn't know who is really a faithful person in the covenant and an unfaithful person. Rather, he must test the people. He doesn't have prophetic insight is the point. And we also learn in 1QS that what is being written in Qumran is not authoritative scripture. We see this later on where the people are commanded to study and discern who the sons of righteousness are. But let's back up. So how do we know that they don't see their own scripture as canonical? It's because in 1Q1, 13 through 14, the instructor says, don't deviate from the words of God. And that's clearly referring to Moses and the prophets, not to things in their own community. So the point is, there's no prophet in the Second Temple period. There's nobody who has the ability to write under the inspiration of God authoritative scripture. We see that in 1 Maccabees, and we see that in 1QS. Also, the New Testament assumes a closed canon as well. You have verses like Matthew 5:18 that says, not a dot will pass away. Matthew 24:30 through 35, the word of the Lord remains forever. We also have instances like in John 19:36, where the scripture must be fulfilled, and we get this summary of the whole canon in Luke 24:44, where Jesus says the law, the prophets, and the Psalms are standing in for the rest of the writings. They all point to Jesus. So this is some evidence that indicates that the Old Testament canon was closed, namely they weren't accepting new books in the canon. You can also think about Ben Sira. So if you just type into Google Ben Sira or Ben Syriac, there's a prologue to that written in Greek, and this is from the 2nd century BC. And there also he mentions the Law of the Prophets and the other books. Josephus, he's writing in the 1st century AD, and he just clearly says there's 22 books of the canon. And it's not even his main point. It's not even like that's the thing he's arguing for. It's just a known fact. So that tradition must be much earlier than Josephus, or if it wasn't, and he was like, hey, there's 22 books of the canon, his audience would be like, no, there's not. There's like 40 books. So that points to his trustworthiness as well. So with that said, how do we know that the Old Testament canon was stable by the Second Temple period is because we have a lot of documents that indicate that there is no prophet. There's nobody who has the ability to write authoritative scripture. That's point one. Second, the New Testament affirms this by saying things like, oh, the scripture must be fulfilled, and when Jesus says the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. And also we have Josephus, who makes that clear statement that only 22 books of the canon. All this evidence combined is indicating that there is a closed canon, a canon that's no longer accepting books into it during the Second Temple period. So I think those are all the questions I've been getting from people. Oh yeah, Gabriel asked a question. He asked if I would just put it as a PDF, the definitions for a few things. Oh, I'm just going to say them here. So again, what is a covenant? The ingredients to a covenant are an elected relationship, under obligations, and sworn by an oath. So election, it's elected, there's obligations to it, and then there's an oath that affirms it. And a canon is an authoritative revelation in document form. That means it's written down. It's just not oral. That can't be changed. At least it can't be changed by the lesser person. It can't be changed. So I think those were the two definitions that Gabriel wanted. So I'm going to go ahead and post this. And you know what? I'm going to make a discussion board as well, so that if you guys want to ask more questions, you guys can put your questions there, and I'll do my best in the next day or two to keep looking at that and answering any questions that appear. So again, I want you to do well. There's no trickery here. I think you guys will do fine. But yeah, ask the questions on the discussion board that I'm about to make, and watch this video. And yeah, I'll be praying for you, and I'm excited about seeing you guys on Monday. All right.